got the fat villain.
So I was really hoping I wouldn't have to talk about Marvel for at least the rest of the year, just because of how every discussion of the MCU always devolves into a minefield of broken hearts, shattered fingers, and lost brain cells. And I guess it also doesn't help that my opinion on every Marvel property these days varies from "wow, that was the worst thing I've ever watched" to "wow, that surprisingly wasn't the worst thing I've ever watched." I kinda see the whole thing as a circle jerk that no one will ever win, so what's the point in throwing my hat in the ring? But then She-Hulk came out, and I guess more importantly to this video, the discourse surrounding She-Hulk came out, and holy shit guys, what the fuck? I don't really like throwing around the word sexist when it's not warranted, but there isn't really another word for what's going on here. You see, comic book fans are, how you say, fucking stupid, but if the only point I made in this video was that misogyny bad, please don't do a misogyny, that would also be pretty stupid because you probably already know that, or at least you should. No, the problem is much deeper than that. Marvel has been sowing the seeds for these kinds of fan reactions for a while now, but whether or not you think this is due to incompetency or more intentional on the part of the studio is kind of the big question here. But let's talk about She-Hulk and why everyone is so upset over the She-Hulk show. Sorry, I just had to say that out loud to see if it sounded any less ridiculous. It didn't. But two things to know before we get into it. One, not a woman. Feel free to ignore anything I have to say because, let's face it, I'm an idiot. And two, I have pretty much zero sympathy for Marvel because at this point I see it more as a machine than anything else, so don't take anything I say as a direct attack on any specific creator. The executives are 100% the ones at fault here. I figured I might as well spell that one out for all the MCU fans watching this because I know you guys run at a slightly lower processing power than the rest of us. Kisses. Anyway, She-Hulk. It's performative activism in its most pure form. I don't really know what to call this kind of writing that pretty much only exists to be screen capped and put on Twitter. For one, it's incredibly lazy. It's just another way of having your audience do all the legwork that the script should have been doing from the very beginning. When everything that should have been subtext becomes the text, it leaves very little room for any actual substance, and structurally, that's the show's biggest flaw, along with the fact that it's trying to be a comedy, a lawyer show, your typical Marvel schlock, and a secret fourth thing which I'll reveal later all at once, despite not really being able to pull any of these off. I think under the best of circumstances, two of these things can work well in tandem. Any more than that and the script becomes bloated. And if you're gonna pick any of these things, pick the first two, please, because quite frankly, I've lost my appetite for PS2 cutscenes. But I honestly don't know why a more subtle approach wasn't taken in injecting feminism into She-Hulk, considering this would quite literally make the show better and would also stave off a lot of the quote woke and quote pandering to women accusation that the series has gotten, since people who complain about that type of shit tend not to be smart enough to understand the concept of inference. If only there was a Marvel TV show that already did all of these things much more gracefully while also having an interesting story that facilitated those themes. Here's a completely unrelated image of Jessica Jones. Kisses! Anyway, this is the part where I go through all the women and I yay or nay my way down the list to determine which ones are good, right? Well, at first, yes, but then I realized that flipping through a PowerPoint of every female character while the Family Feud buzzer plays on loop doesn't exactly make for engaging content, so we're gonna stick with a select few. And I guess I should preface this with the fact that while I have absorbed a disconcerting amount of the content that the MCU has to offer, I have not seen it all, so whatever exception you may be typing in the comments where all the good female representation supposedly is, that one. That's the one I haven't watched. Swallow me. So let's take it back to where it all started. That's right, 2019, which is embarrassingly late for a franchise of this size to have its first full-length feature film outing with a female protagonist, which I think is exactly why the lead-up to this movie's release was so big, or at least it felt like Captain Marvel was being given more significance than the average Marvel fare. It's Kevin's way of making up for lost time, and I guess on paper it makes sense. Having this movie be this big space epic where Brie Larson gets to be an indomitable badass who fucks shit up with her laser hands is cool, except when you realize that outside of all this spectacle, the movie feels empty. By the time the credits roll, I can't really say that I know that much about the character, and this is a big problem considering the entire film is about Carol Danvers rediscovering her lost identity. So when she decimates an entire alien fleet single-handedly, it makes her feel like a vessel for that special brand of girl boss feminism rather than resembling anything with a pulse. The strong female archetype is there, but any nuance isn't. What the film wants me to feel is obvious, but it's not willing to put in any of the work to actually earn this feeling. It's incredibly frustrating to watch, and I know I'm not alone in thinking this, but honestly, if even one little girl walks away feeling empowered because of this movie, it has done its job, and I can't see that as anything but a positive. However, and I know I've said this in the past before, but these movies are now ubiquitous. They aren't just made for little girls, so I don't think expecting a little more depth from the characters is that unreasonable. But at the same time, it's not little girls who are making these 3-hour-long diatribes about how civilization as we know it is crumbling to pieces because of a Marvel movie. But at the same time, these fucking Neanderthals are only able to make these arguments because of how unradical and nothing the activism in the MCU is, and the reason the movies are like this is because of money. So once again, this video is about how much capitalism sucks. Sorry, Dad. But you see what I mean when I said this whole thing is a circle jerk? It's like the Ouroboros for people who huff spray paint. In an ideal world, I think the MCU should represent progress. If these movies are going to continue to be the backbone of pop culture, why wouldn't you as a creator want to push the envelope? And why shouldn't we as a society be allowed to slaughter podcasters indiscriminately? But Gavin, you may be saying to yourself, they're comic book movies. They don't get to be that progressive. These characters and stories were created decades ago. You can't hold them to today's standards. And to that, I'd say, yes, you can. Please finish your corn dog, it's getting cold. The movies are adaptations. They're called that for a reason. They're made to adapt the source material, not spit out a one-to-one carbon copy of the existing work, no matter how many people bitch and complain that this isn't what they do. Of course, not all of these changes end up working. I mean, that's literally what this video is about, but credit where credit is due. When WandaVision was first released, I was excited, or at least as excited as anyone can be about a late-stage MCU product, but can you blame me? It was the promise of something new, and as I was watching, I was shocked to find that this is exactly what WandaVision is. You know, up until it isn't, but let's leave the poor kid alone, it's gone through enough. But as much of an issue that I may have with the immediate plot of the series, the development that Wanda as a character goes through is actually pretty satisfying and genuinely compelling to watch. In a word, the show is about grief, and how to cope with this grief in a healthy way, and it's all done surprisingly well. WandaVision remains one of the few MCU properties I can look to and confidently say that it has a point. Or at least I could say that, because the next time we see Wanda, the audience gets to grieve the death of all art. Multiverse of Madness is the epitome of midness. If I were locked in a room for 30 years with nothing but this movie playing, I still don't think I would have much of an opinion on it as a whole. But more relevant to this video, it completely trashes Wanda's character. She went from being flawed yet still sympathetic to being relegated to angry white woman status because the universe took the M out of her ILF. And just like that, all of the precious development from WandaVision is undone, not to mention that this all feels weirdly antiquated, right? Throughout the film, Wanda being able to be with her children is treated like the one avenue she has to happiness, which would probably sit better with me if this movie was written by literally anyone who isn't a Rick and Morty alumni. But this is far from the first time the MCU has dipped its big hairy toe into the realm of motherhood, so go ahead and buckle up, class, because the guy in the back knows exactly what the fuck I'm about to talk about. Natasha Romanoff at this point in time is probably the single most instantly recognizable female character that Marvel has in their roster, and you know, it makes sense considering she pretty much had a monopoly on the whole having a vagina thing for the first 7 years of the MCU. But Nat was always a character whose inclusion in these movies confounded me to no end. I mean, she definitely showed up in a lot of them, but despite her uncanny ability to routinely collect a Disney paycheck, I can't really say that she left that big of an impact on me or the series. She came, she strangled some dude with her thighs or something, she died, and then she got her own microscopic spotlight. More on that in a second. But I want to talk about probably the most egregious example of big strong white man with penis drags meaty 8 fingers across keyboard. Much like every other film I've gone over, Age of Ultron is also a very mediocre movie. Wow, it's almost like all of them are like that and they really aren't worth talking about, and we should probably stop using them as a benchmark to measure art or some kind of end goal for aspiring creators. Huh. Anyway, if WandaVision is about grief, Age of Ultron is a film about monsters, or at least it says the word monster a lot and expects the audience to use context clues to decipher what the fuck any of this is supposed to mean. But towards the middle of the film, there's a scene showcasing the forced Natasha-Bruce romance, and this idea of being a monster comes up again. Bruce is feeling not so incredible because, well, self-explanatory, and Nat goes, "No, Mark Ruffalo, man who blacks out for hours at a time when he turns into an extraordinarily destructive 8-foot green alien. You're not the real monster, I am. Because I can't get pregnant." And I think the terribleness of this scene and all of its implications speak for itself, so I won't try to squeeze any additional insight out of it. However, I do want to say, if this is what the MCU had up its sleeves in the way of character development, it's no wonder it took nearly 10 years for Black Widow to get her own solo movie, which, you guessed it, is a one-slice toaster. Useless. It feels like a complete afterthought and doesn't really work as the sentimental one last ride send-off for the character that I think it was going for. You know, it's just disappointing, because what you're left with here is a character who is tossed around and abused by the writers and the fans, but as easy as it is to point at these fans and say that their incel tomfoolery is 1000% the problem, part of the blame falls on those behind the scenes for conditioning their audience to think this way. Because as a writer, if you treat the women you're writing with respect, you'll cultivate an audience that respects women. It's that fucking simple. But let's circle back to She-Hulk, and I guess more specifically the way it ended, which was controversial, maybe? I don't know, it's hard to gauge that kind of thing when it comes to these people. The secret fourth thing is that She-Hulk is secretly a psyop of both itself and the MCU as a whole. It ends with this big fourth wall breaking meta commentary about how played out the Marvel formula is, and originally the script had a big long paragraph about how refreshing it was that the creators took a step back and acknowledged the issues with their writing and took a step to fix these issues. But then when I took a step back from what I was writing, I came to the realization that I was praising the MCU for doing the bare minimum. Because you guys realize what this is, right? It's not some clever bow to put on an honestly okay season of television. It's an admission of guilt. By acknowledging that the grand culmination of all of the mystery and intrigue set up throughout the season is a big heaping pile of force-fed fucking jalopy, you are admitting that all of the setup and therefore the entire show is also bad. And I guess that's my point. If the writers are smart enough to know that there is a problem with the way that females are represented in their stories, they are smart enough to write them as better, more compelling characters. So basically just the screenshot from that Sonic cartoon.
We like ice cream like every child should, and if we get some ice cream.
Also, talking about Marvel is like a YouTube cheat code, and where's the fun in making videos if people are gonna actually watch them?